My name is Sarah Kathleen Taylor Foster.
Okay, and then when were you born?
I was born February the 21st, 1937.
Okay.
I have been told some migration stories, yes. And we know that one family, my grandmother's family, was last name was Synnott, Synnott, which means sin not. And so I've located the area of Ireland that the Synnotts are from,
Okay.
and almost got there, but I didn't. And then from some of the other British Isles also, uh, the ancestors came from there, but quite long ago. And even considering that, more recent migration or stories, I guess you would say, is that some of the family came from South Carolina, and we know that. And my great, let's say I counted it up, and I think it's five greats. Uh, Fathers, two of them were literally in the Civil War. And it was very sad for the South, too, looking back at history, because the Southerners suffered greatly during the Civil War. And I heard some of those stories somewhat handed down from the family about how two different great grandfathers walked all the way from South Carolina barefooted at the end of the Civil War. One Christmas, well, my mother died when I was 5 years old, and there were two old maid aunts that means unmarried, aunts who were helping to raise the family, okay? And my family was unusual from the point of view that on my mother's side, the women were well educated and all in education. Okay, and so there was my Aunt Corinne, Sarah Corinne, and my Sarah comes from Aunt Corinne, Patty, Aunt Patty, and then my oldest sister's named Patty after her, and then my mother's name was Mary, and then her maiden name was Lamb, and so my third sister's name was Mary Lamb, and then uh, I mentioned my name came from my Aunt Corinne, and so it was common to use family names then. And it was kind of interesting and sad. My mother died 7 days after my youngest sister Martha was born, and we never did find out exactly why she died because they weren't doing autopsies then, and it could have been a hard pregnancy or her body could have been just tired. But because this baby was born in a hospital, which was not the usual thing back in the 30s and early 40s. And so my aunts kind of took over with each child having a very special aunt. And my very special aunt was my Aunt Corinne. And so she was a very influential person in my life, and we did a lot of things together. Um, but going back to the war years, the kinds of things that we did, um, we during the war years, and I'm referring to the Second World War because that was the one that was I when I was a child, the Second World War. And things were scarce, and so we had to make do with what we had. And in our home in Upor at Christmas time, one Christmas, we went down, Daddy said, let's go down to the basement for a minute. Well, what do we go down in the basement for? And there was a bunch of bananas down there. About 3 to 4 feet long. If you've ever seen a real bunch of bananas growing together. And back in those days, as I mentioned, fresh fruit was very scarce because most of the ships were used to haul war materials and soldiers. And so it was probably black market. Do you know what black market is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And people would have stamps. You know,
Yeah.
you would be allowed so many stamps, and the family could buy so much sugar or so much scarcity and a bunch of bananas was just, you know, one of the greatest gifts in the whole world because, you know, after all, even the stores hardly had bunches of bananas. Um, and so, uh, growing up where things were scarce, everything except love, I guess, and love was very abundant. People cared for each other. It was very safe for kids to walk from one house to another and play outside. And after my mother died, I thought.
All right, good. All right, so we got the war covered, and now let's get more personal. Let's hear, how did you meet Grandpa Jack? A little bit later in your life, but we can go back and forth. So, yep.
Okay, I had traveled the world, okay, and I had visited, I taught for the Department of Defense, and so I had visited, I had a roommate from Michigan, and all the people who had worked together at Ravenstein, Germany, teaching in the Department of Defense schools, had a reunion in Michigan, okay? And I thought it was a beautiful state. We were out by lakes, and we were out by a lake, and then some of her relatives had a cabin in the lake, and by the lake, and so here we were having a reunion, and I thought it was so gorgeous. And she lived on a farm with a big red barn on it, okay? And that was my first image of Michigan, okay? And then I went back overseas to teach for the Department of Defense, and then I decided that I would, Michigan State began to have, they were going to have a plan overseas that people could be trained and get advanced degrees by being in overseas, okay? So I came to go to Michigan State, okay? And because I had enjoyed that trip here so much, and I thought I might enjoy living in Michigan. Back when I was a child, too, during the Depression, there was very, very, very little industry in the state of Mississippi. And so a lot of Southerners came up to work in the car factories,
Yeah.
you know, during the Depression. And so my Aunt Alice and my Uncle Bob, you know, came up and settled in Flint, all right? So after I came to Michigan, we reconnected. It was kind of funny because when they would come back south in the summers, uh, and we would go around town, and I would have my cousin to talk with her northern accent to the people in Eupora. And then I found out after I came to Michigan, people wanted me to talk because of my southern accent. But anyhow, I was visiting with my my aunt and uncle and my first cousin, Doris. And so I was a single parent with your mom, and so uh, we were talking about men in Michigan, and I said, well, I just haven't met a right one yet, you know, for Laura and me. And she says, well, I know the right one. You want a farmer or a city slicker? And I said, oh, a farmer. I've always wanted to live on a farm. And so she says, I know just the one for you. So she arranged a blind date for us. And it was, yes, it was kind of love at first sight. And to be sentimental a little bit, the first time ever I saw your face was a very popular song then. And we went with Doris and her husband, and first time I ever saw your face was playing on the radio. We went to Ann Arbor, you know, for dinner. And so as we got back to Aunt Allie's and Uncle Bob's, and so forth. And he says, you want to stop by the farm tomorrow? And I said, he says, it's right on your way, back to Lansing. And so I did, and that's the way I met him, and we just both knew that it was the right choice for both of us.
That is a cute love story. Wow. Okay. So another personal question after that one.
Much so. Um, it was a community that, um, well, there were actually two communities. They were 6 miles apart. The village of Wallfall, which maybe the population was, well, I understand when my grandfather, was there, it was like a population of 50. But, by the time that I was there, I'm sure there was a population of 100 that lived in the city limits or town limits, okay? And Eupora was right at 2,000, and I remember it dropped to 1,800 at some point, and it's still about that same size. But now, out from town, the towns have grown up more, and industry has come into, the town now. But at that particular time, there was very little industry and more just mercantile stores and dry goods stores and drug stores, okay, and all the time. And I can remember that quite vividly. And he would be announcing it. And we did have a movie theater there in Eupora, okay? There was one in the county, and it happened to be in Eupora. And they would have, before the main feature, they would show Movietone News, okay? And it would be in black and white, and it would show what was happening overseas. It would just be glimpses of the tanks and that kind of thing. So that's one way that we got news from the war, was going to the Movietone or going to the movies and seeing the Movietone News. And when I ended up later on going to an area in France that they have a World War II museum, okay, and they were continuously showing those same, and this would be in recent years, and they would be continuously showing in that theater. They had put together a lot of those black and white Movietone News. And so a film had to be very special to be in Technicolor, but very definitely movies as a teenager, and growing up were highlights. And some of the rural children would do things like, well, I would go with my Aunt Pat and my Uncle Philip to all-day singings. They would have dinner on the ground, and then they would have all-day singings, okay? And every year, a gospel hymn book would come out. It was a softback book, okay? And with the softback book, and my uncle even wrote 2 or 3 of the songs, okay? And they would come out, and he would learn to sing them by singing do, re, mi. He would go up the scale. And I was amazed by that he could read music and learn the songs. And then on Sunday, they would have some quartets that would participate, or they'd have the all-day singings and dinner on the ground. And I've often wondered why people didn't die of food poisoning now that I'm grown with all that fried chicken outside in the hot sun. It was traditional. Back in those days, a girl, a lot of my classmates even married their high school sweethearts. And so people married a lot younger, I think, then, and, high school romances were fairly, popular at that particular point. Although I had a lot of friends, I didn't have a steady boyfriend. But so a lot, in those days, if you were going on to college for a career, it would probably be for teaching or nursing. And secretaries, a lot of my friends from high school. Um, well, she's got such talent.
Mm-hmm.
But so my Aunt Corinne, who was teaching, when she came back to be the family matron, came back and she would be grading papers. She'd go sit in the living room and sit there by the piano with me. And I can remember her grading papers while she was listening to me practice the piano.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard her say, "This little boy could read. Nobody has ever tried to teach him to read." Reflecting back on what I know now about backgrounds and how
Yeah.
they affect your ambition,
Mm-hmm.
and I realized that they were from some poor families that did not encourage reading and probably did not have reading material in their home. But she said there, she says, "I just don't think anybody's ever really tried to teach him." And she says, "I think I can teach him how to read." And I think that was the statement that made me know that I wanted to go into education,
Mm-hmm.
because my beloved Aunt Corinne, could teach a child to read and give a child that treasure that I thought most children had.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really special. Okay, so I think that we got a lot of good information. I think we're gonna have